brings back the right to choose what human action you would like to take. And, it does tip the scales. And, with the sovereign individual thesis, for example, it the way they kind of frame, the evolution of returns to violence or returns on violence. And what Bitcoin does fundamentally is it lowers the cost of defense, it increases the cost of attack, and in doing so, we kind of we place grooves in the if you kind of picture almost like a piece of wood with some grooves in it, and you splash water on it, the water will sort of you can't make the water all go in the groove, but it the tendency is to sort of fall into the groove. And I think that's Bitcoin brings those grooves back into alignment with natural order, and the sort of the voluntary nature of existence. And I just think it's important for people, I think, to realize that it's not, we're not out for a utopia. Like, Bitcoin isn't some utopian dream or utopian ideal where everything's fucking perfect, because a utopia is the surest, fastest way to a dystopia. Because, my utopia is completely different to yours and completely different to everyone else's. So the only thing that is functional is, the ability to make a sovereign choice. And that naturally scales to a certain degree. And that is naturally a system that is far more fragmented, centralized, localized, etc. And, people are allowed to be different and have their own values and beliefs and sort of coalesce around that. So I just wanted to add some color to that.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I'm not sure how my last little spiel came off. I'm definitely not insinuating that Bitcoin kind of makes everyone the same. I just mean that, it provides the opportunity to preserve the integrity of each person's will, right? So when you act, nobody is adding extra data to that expression. There's still, of course, hierarchies everywhere and meritocracies, and everyone has to compete on their merits. But just when you act, the fact that nobody is going to disintermediate or dilute your capacity, what you're communicating when you act. So the competition will still be there, hierarchies will still be there, rich people, poor people, but just the fact that we can have, to the extent that money is an expression of our will in the market, nobody can disintermediate or dilute or pervert the integrity of that. And I think that's amazing. And I think that means that the market is going to be a greater reflection of all of our collective wills. It's still with all of our imperfections as well, of course. But I think what it poses is an interesting question is when that kind of leech or that parasite is taken off the market, that is siphoning away people's will and marshaling their will kind of without their permission, or at least in a helpless sort of way where they can't do anything about it. When that's not the case anymore, when people have control of the integrity of how they express themselves in the market, the question that I think is really interesting is, well, let's call that a form of freedom. Of course, you're not absolutely free, but let's say that freedom to express yourself is of the kind and nature that nobody has ever had before. What do you do with that? And as you were saying, Alex, the sovereign individual thesis plays in here, and taking greater sovereignty and responsibility for, at first, your finances, and then in many other aspects of your life. I think, when I framed up the discussion at the beginning, saying that, a lot of interesting behavioral changes happen to people when they get down the Bitcoin rabbit hole. I think part of the reason why, and there's many, many parts, but is because people are confronted for the first time as, what would you do with freedom? And I know it's not all at once, it's not immediate, and it's not complete. But when they start to realize that taking this form of sovereignty, and however narrow a scope we think it is, and I think we all agree that money is not so narrow a scope, it's pretty fundamental. But when you've done that, and as you continue to understand how to do that, I think it forces the spotlight a little bit back on us to say, okay, our whole life, because our will has been siphoned and marshaled away, we've kind of had to subjugate ourselves to a variety of different circumstances and work, and basically we had our motivations imposed on us by the fact that a small group of other people could effectively marshal our will, or at least dramatically dilute it. And so now I think a lot of people are forced to answer the question, what would you do, or what will you do when you have this degree of sovereignty and freedom? And I think for a lot of people that can be frightening, but for a lot of us, I think, we feel the gravity of that question, and it almost compels change when you find yourself in such a dramatically different circumstance, and you look out at the world with different eyes as a result, and you're compelled to change behavior. It's not, I think for a lot of us, it's not even a conscious choice a lot of the time. We just, there's a different set of motivations that are playing on us, and we're playing in a different environment, and that necessitates different behavior. And so, everyone's answering that in different ways. And but I think that's one of the core questions, is when people are confronted with, what do I do with this type of freedom? I think that's why we're seeing a lot of people change fundamentally how they see the world and how they behave. And I think the more of that, the better. And then the fact that those changed people, those, let's say, if I can presume to say, upgraded people, are then more able to express who they are in the world, despite the fact there'll be challenges, despite the fact that there'll be people more or less powerful, quote unquote, than them. The fact that we just have more people that are able to do that, I think, over time, as you say, will net an increasingly, more positive, at least more free world. There's always going to be challenges and downsides, but I just wanted to clarify that point.
Humans are going to human despite 100%. The money, but I agree with both of you. It's going to make us. I will say it's going to make us a lot happier. And part of it is, yes, it's kind of enforcing or compelling us to live a more principled life. And it is more efficiently communicating our wills, our desires, our needs, our wants to the rest of the world, and allowing the rest of the world to more efficiently provide solutions and satisfy those wants and needs. And so it just makes us happier, right? And then we also have more time. Like, we're going to have a lot more time because of Bitcoin, because we're literally getting our time back. Robert very eloquently writes about time theft and masters and slaves of money, and other pieces as well. And it's a perfect phrase, and it will go down in history as a phrase of Bitcoin, early Bitcoin philosophy, because it perfectly encapsulates what's happening here. We are literally having our time stolen from us. We're working hours that we would never have had to work had we had a gold standard or like an unco-optable money, right? As we know, gold is not that. But if we had had a money like Bitcoin all this time, we would, because of deflationary technology and advancements and exponential advancement of productivity, we'd all be maybe working, like 10 years, 5 years in our professional lives, and not that many hours a week, because we'd have so much like access to our needs and wants would be filled so much more efficiently. And we'd have all this time then to spend on our passions, on what really drives us, really is something that we want to wake up and like be excited about doing, instead of having these, sort of soul-sucking jobs that we have to, spend our time on because we have to keep up with, our money, our time being inflated away from us. So yes, I do think we're going to have a happier world. Brandon, Gigi, we haven't heard from you guys in a while. I wanted to pass it over to one of you guys.
Yeah, I've got a point to add right to that, which is, if we have this new, pure, incorruptible monetary substance that's Bitcoin, it shifts the incentives at the very bottom of society. And from a real sense, it's actually going to make us more wealthy. And a monetary substance like Bitcoin incentivizes value creation rather than today, which is the incentives are to sort of become a parasite of the state and sort of a cantillionaire way. And long term, the value will flow to value creators. And right now, Bitcoiners are going to sort of capture a large percentage of that. And also, Bitcoin is an open system. And so anyone can participate rather than being stuck under the thumb of your local jurisdiction. And so it brings on latent human capital. Think of all the Nikola Teslas or Maya Angelos that are stuck right now in a developing country, and they can't participate in the global economy. And so by bringing those folks online, by moving more capital allocation to people that actually create real value, that's going to lead to more trade, more economic participants, more wealth, et cetera. And long term, that's just, I can't even comprehend how positive that will be for society. And obviously the transition we're about to go through here, who knows? That's probably going to be rocky. That's probably going to be, very violent in some sense. But luckily, we do have Bitcoiners here who, if I had to put the capital allocation responsibility on any group today, it's very clearly this ragtag group of independent people, first principles thinkers, no bullshit, no politics de jour, legitimately trying to seek truth, and then coming together and having values of truth and hardening each other's arguments and our positions. And so, yeah, I just couldn't be more optimistic about a world built on those type of principles.
Gigi?
Yeah.
Switch on your Galaxy game, brother.
I'm not sure if I have so much to add. I think one thing that I realized recently was, I believe at least, I always wondered why Bitcoin changes people in such a profound way, or many people at least. Many Bitcoiners report that after wrestling with this thing for a while, that it simply changes you and changes your habits and your outlook and so on. And of course, Seyfedin talks about the lowering of your time preference and how sound money lowers your time preference. But I think it is the combination of this lowering of your time preference with the radical responsibility that being a first-class Bitcoin citizen requires of you, like holding your own keys, running your own node, verifying everything you can yourself, and not trusting others to do it for you, is definitely something that plays a large part in that as well. And I think this is also what we see seeping out in other areas. And there are more and more sovereign individuals that take matters in their own hands and try to solve the problems on their own, so to speak, and try not to outsource them. But I also want to loop back to something John said. I believe that Bitcoin is not the end all and be all of money, and it will be replaced by something else far, far in the future, I'm sure. And yes, it's true that forever is a very long time, but still, I think it's important to point out what kind of innovations, what kind of breakthroughs Bitcoin actually brought with it, what kind of problems Satoshi actually managed to solve. And I think it's twofold. I mean, people talk about the solution of the double spending problem all the time, or how the Byzantine generous problem was solved. And yeah, that's true. But I think just like, for example, in the informational realm, the only realm where perfect copies are possible is when you do it in the realm of information. Otherwise, you will always have degradation if you try to rearrange atoms in the same way. You can't do it perfectly. That's why DNA works so well. Like you need error correction, and error correction only works if you're dealing with information. And in the same way, Bitcoin managed to produce something that is absolute scarcity. And this cannot work if you have a physical medium behind it. It only works if you do it in information. It only works basically in the way how Bitcoin does it, like in a purely informational realm. And this brings me to the second breakthrough that I think Bitcoin brought with it. It moved money from the physical realm to the realm of ideas, to the purely informational digital realm. Call it as you wish, but the fact that you can store Bitcoin in your head by just remembering 12 words is such a profound shift in how money works and what you can do with it. It is very hard to overstate how insane this is actually. And it's not only the fact that you can have Bitcoin and all your wealth that you amassed in your head. It's also what follows from that is that you can do constructs like splitting up keys, like multi-signature schemes. The whole concept of ownership gets more nuanced. It almost breaks down in some edge cases. So I think if we have something that steps to the next level, it has to be very similar in that regard. And I think the genius of Satoshi was also, like Robert wrote about in Bitcoin and the number zero, to choose a terminal inflation rate of 0%. And this is already really perfect. And since it is informational, we will always have the UTXO set. And if something, like if Bitcoin can be improved, it will be improved, and it will take the current distribution, the fairest distribution that we could have, since it was such a bottom-up, organic, silent launch. and we'll build from there. So even though I agree, it probably, like, forever is a long time. No matter how bullish you are, forever is a really long time. But I think we can always build up on it, and I think that's a beautiful thing.
I want to pose a question to the group, a different topic that expands on what we've been talking about. But we started talking about this idea of consilience and convergence, and then we also discussed the emergent properties of money. And I'm curious to hear you guys' thoughts on what will be converged upon because of the Bitcoin emerged into reality, right? So let's think about like the fact that Gigi's saying that we have this pure informational money, and we're living in an increasingly purely informational world, right? And everything's being what is the word that Saylor uses? It's not virtualized, but that's essentially what is happening. Dematerialized, exactly. So I feel like Bitcoin is sort of the first fundamental foundational stone in like a pyramid of sovereignty that we can build in the informational world as a response, an immune response to this, this top-down, this basically autocratic, time-thieving society that we've been living in for a long time. It's been so easily corrupted or easily results in that outcome, right? That people are being controlled. We have the similar situation with our personal data, other information, so much stuff that's out there being captured by top-down walled gardens, massively powerful corporations owning all this data. Gigi, I'll start with you because I think you'll have something interesting to say on this. But what do you think Bitcoin can set a precedent for us to be able to have sovereignty over our personal information, over our thoughts, over all of our identity itself in a world where we're heading toward dematerializing everything, including our thoughts?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think Bitcoin will usher in also a kind of new way of thinking around data and owning your data, because with Bitcoin it's kind of obvious. If you don't own the important parts of the data, then it's not your Bitcoin, not your keys, not your Bitcoin. And I think we can already see that playing out with people working on software solutions that bundle different services into something that approximates a node in your home that just hosts you not only your Bitcoin stuff, but also parts of your data or parts of your communication network. And I think this will be an interesting development, that once you are kind of sensitive to those kind of things, you see them pop up everywhere and you try to be more self-sovereign in the digital realm. And I think it also starts with very small things, like taking your digital hygiene more seriously and using security measures like two-factor authentication, stuff like that. But I would also like to point out in terms of Bitcoin being informational, I think it's worth stating, and I think it's a true statement, there is no higher realm than the informational. There is no higher realm than the realm of ideas. There's nothing higher you could move to. And I think that's worth thinking about, in the same sense that once you move to information for pretty much anything, again, to take the example of DNA or take the example of binary encoding with computers, it doesn't matter. Once you're informational, there is no higher plane to move towards. So I think in that regard, Bitcoin has reached the final stage in terms of money. If you don't need a physical instantiation of it anymore, then you're already doing pretty good.
I think I'd like to touch on what we were talking about a bit earlier on the idea of sovereignism. And what exactly is sovereignty? And Carl Schmitt, who's well regarded as probably being the 20th century's leading expert on sovereignty, he defines it as the sovereign is he who decides on the exception. So going into a dematerialized world, what I start to see is that individuals actually get to flex their sovereignty by finally making the decision of what is the exception. And the system will run by the rules perfectly until the individual actors who have sovereignty over their private keys will make the choice to do otherwise. And I think that that's a big part of what Bitcoin is offering, is that this is the first real taste of sovereignty that any of us have ever had, and that any human beings have been given since really the dawn of the nation state. And I think as we start to utilize and flex this form of sovereignty more and more, not only are we going to become getting more and more different protocols around data storage, protecting our identities, protecting our wealth, but I actually think that this all becomes political at some point in time, where we go, why are we using these antiquated systems from 200 years ago that claim to be democratic but are far, far from it, in addition to the fact that they're wrecking our wealth and stealing from us every day. And I think people are going to see that maybe we don't need to tolerate that anymore. And when they see that cryptography was developed as a tool and a weapon of war, the ability to be able to communicate secretly and to be able to organize and to respond accordingly without having your enemy understand, I think this all escalates to a place of where sovereignism as an idea starts to take hold. And I mean, on this call alone, we have at least 4 nationalities represented here. And I think all of us would identify more strongly as being Bitcoiners than as being, American or Australian or whatever you may have. And I think that's a very, very, yeah, and I think that's 100%. Really fucking exciting that we're at the precipice of what is going to become the most substantial change in human history, the one where we transition from statism, hopefully, to sovereignty.
Beautiful. I wanted to, and yes, for the record, I identify as a, I was going to say something dumb. I identify as a Bitcoiner. I wanted to pull on the thread of the dematerialization, and I think, I kind of probably diverge with Gigi in this one. Is I think people like Ray Kurzweil and stuff like that are fucking lunatics. I don't like them at all. I think they got a few predictions right and stuff like that, but I think they're just as dangerous as a Hillary Clinton or someone like that, because they sort of believe in these utopian endpoints of we're all gonna put our brains in of that, and we'll combine with an AI and we'll achieve everlasting bliss. And I guess maybe I'm just more of a little bit more old school there, maybe more of a humanist if I was going to have to slap a label on it. But I just think that I'm going to take a contrarian viewpoint here, and this is an opinion loosely held. So I'd love to hear feedback from the group after this. But this idea that as the pendulum has swung so far towards bits and bytes and information, dematerialization, all that sort of stuff, I actually think there exists a huge contrarian position in the world of in the material world of atoms and the ability to solve problems in ways that aren't so-called dematerialized in nature. So a really great example is there's all this talk about we're all going to die because of global warming, and we've all been dying next year for the last fucking 30 years now. And there's people like Jamal Palihapitiya and stuff are throwing out ridiculous amounts of money for some sort of technological fixes to a phantom problem, whereas the real fix is buy land and plant trees, and we solve a lot of that stuff. So it's I feel like as we move toward, as the pendulum swings towards this insane run towards dematerialization, there will be a huge opportunity for the emergence of innovation, invention, and productivity, and life and stuff in the material world, which I think are going to be profoundly important. Going back to the roots of growing our food and sort of being in a more of a symbiosis with the physical, material, natural world and things like that. And I actually think Bitcoin is very, 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 very consistent with that, because it starts to, again, it fragments the push towards, globalization and this sort of homogenization of humans and all this sort of shit. So I don't know. I just think I take that viewpoint. I don't know how contrarian it is here. I don't know how much of a so-called unpopular opinion it is, but I think there's huge opportunities in the world of atoms and in the material world, not just the sort of the dematerialization and the sort of, because I think that's definitely the thing that people have been chasing. And I actually think that the amount that people have chased that is also deformed because of the money printer. It was much easier and quicker to develop, Twitter than it is to go and solve a real material problem like poverty in Africa. So as a result, money was allocated, by Wall Street to shit like that. It has its benefits and everything. I'm not bagging Twitter, but I just think that, as Bitcoin emerges, we'll start to solve, those kind of, for lack of a better term here, real problems and things like that. And I just think there is definitely a future for the materialization of existence. So throw that back to the group. Call me a bigot. Tell me where I'm wrong.
I just want to clarify that what I meant when I was saying that is there are some things that only work in the informational realm and in the realm of ideas. For example, if I have an idea and you have an idea and we exchange those ideas, both of us have two ideas. And this is not possible with physical items. So these are the things I'm talking about. And the same goes for copying and error correction. So I'm not cheering on, spoiler alert, Ray Kurzweil will die. So sorry for all singularity folks. But
yeah, he's right. He's gonna die.
But still, technological progress is undoubtedly exponential, and this must not be dismissed. But I agree, of course, that we are living in physical space, and we have to solve physical problems in this physical space. But still, there are some things that you can only do when you transform stuff into information. And that's what I was talking about.
Well, this seems to be a fidelity and a time preference issue that allows for the two to sync better. Because now that our time preference isn't all fucked up, we can be like, oh, hey, growing my own food and cultivating an orchard for the next 1,000 years is going to be a fruitful endeavor for the rest of humanity.
Yeah, and it does bring up an interesting point, Alex. And I share that sentiment. I think a lot of Bitcoiners, and I know this from having so many conversations, that a lot of Bitcoiners kind of yearn for that private, independent, sort of life in solitude, with family and loved ones, and pretty much as independent as you can get. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive, as Gigi was saying. But it does beg the question. And Brandon brought up kind of the role of money as a meta incentive, that kind of underlies all other incentives on top of it. And one of the questions that comes up a lot here, and the reason why it sparked in my mind is because you kind of mentioned meat space as a something to consider. It is kind of, even though we can establish sovereignty over our money, and all the things that means. How do power dynamics still play out in the world? And is there anything that can be done about those, or how should we expect them to change? And I think, the sovereign individual has been mentioned. And I think we all probably agree that was a very prescient book, but also very insightful. And I think we will see things unfold in the manner in which they articulate in that book. But still, I power is like a universal, right? Like if one planet that's 10 times bigger than another one slams into it, the big planet wins. And how does that sort of issue, to the extent that it holds humanity back or creates too much suffering, how do we address that? And one of the reasons why I think Bitcoin is so profound, because the money is always the meta incentive, right? So if we upgrade the money, I feel like we upgrade the meta incentive. And the reason why I think the quality of the meta incentive matters is because I think the degree to which we can align incentives is what restrains power dynamics from prevailing. And, I was thinking about it recently, in a sort of equation form. And, this is literally off the top of my head, but what coalesced was, freedom, peace, and prosperity equals the imbalance of power minus aligned incentives. And so to the extent, and, I think that's important. The reason why that's relevant is because I think if we allow things to play out based on the dynamics of power power threatens destruction, I guess we can say, and aligned incentives promote creation. And so I think we all prefer the latter. And so the degree to which we can align incentives, I think, really, really matters, because as a result of restraining power, it promotes freedom and peace and prosperity, et cetera. So I just wanted to add that in because there was an interesting discussion about incentives that almost got kicked off there, and I was thinking about it lately and wanted to share it.
Yeah, I love what you said about that little equation there. So I think I kind of view human beings, at an individual level, we're problem-solving machines. We're always doing that. We're always trying to figure something out, like day in, day out. That's what we do. That's, sort of how the brain emerged. And the thing is, like, when incentives are misaligned, when you have this, when prices don't function properly, when the cost of fucking plastic is so cheap, but, the cost of other shit is so expensive, like when everything's sort of skewed, what we end up doing is, we are problem solving. Like, at the end of the day, that's what we're always doing. But we're sort of solving fake problems. I did a tweet about this ages ago. I was like, real problems is things like, poverty. Real problems is things like starvation, and sort of fake problems are things like fucking, you're going to kill grandma because, you're not wearing a mask. So it's like we're sort of, we've completely diverged on, not diverged, but we've completely lost focus around where the real problems are, because the signals have been all, out of whack for so long. And then, as all systems do, as they try and self-correct and as they try and absorb, incoming information and deal with it, is we kind of take this, false price signals. We take these, false incentives, and then we go and, create shit that we don't need, which then further skews things and further deforms things. And we're sort of like in this lost, limbo where we don't really know what we're trying to fix. We can't really articulate problems. And again, there is no, at the risk of sounding defeatist here, there's no silver bullet, there's no panacea to this sort of fix. But when you kind of go for the root, which is like, how do we fix that, the meta piece that allows us to then properly measure incentives, and like what we were discussing earlier, like human action being the most important mechanism for existence. Like, human action is speech. It is like, don't tell me what you say. Like, I don't believe what you say. Don't tell me what you believe. Show me what you do, and I'll tell you what you believe. And it's like, that is so important. And, money is the layer in society, like as that metaphysical piece of the puzzle, is what enables us to make better, human action. and I just love sort of what you said there, John, in sort of framing it almost as an equation. So that also kind of, brings to mind, as well as just it ties into the original idea that Brandon mentioned about conciliation and alignment, is, in solving all the wrong problems, we don't really have an alignment. And I've used this analogy before in another talk, is at the moment, the world economy and existence and everything looks kind of like that Brazilian bodybuilder who pumped synthol into his biceps, and he's got these 36-inch arms, but he's got, these sort of chicken legs, and he has a twig on the rest of his body. So we've kind of got this deformed world at the moment where we've got an oversized advertising industry, we've got an oversized Wall Street, we've got an oversized tech industry, and they all sort of all feed into each other. But everything else is completely undersized. Like we're pathetic in a lot of other ways. And that is, again, because we've got this blind chase for whether it's yield, for whether it's the quick buck, it's the get rich quick fucking, if I see another app that tells me that I can trade stocks for free, I'm going to neck myself, because it's like, we're sort of chasing that same shit over and over again. We think we're solving problems, but we're not, because they're phantom problems. And I think, Bitcoin helps realign the movement towards solving a real problem. And this, I'll tie it back into what I mentioned earlier about, we've been talking about dematerialization now for the last 2, 3, 4 decades with the rise of the internet and sort of the rise of bits and bytes. But, as Peter Thiel talks about is, we've had loads of information in the information space, in the bits and bytes, but very little in the atoms. And I just think that there is a huge, huge opportunity out that way. And again, it's really interesting for me to see how Bitcoiners perceive that stuff, and how we're sort of talking about not only Bitcoin but these broader issues and how we can solve them through similar principles, through first principles, through age old emergent ideas and things that are like. I'll tie one last thing in here is like Bitcoin's strength is almost in its simplicity of what it delivers. It's like, yep, fixed supply money, uncensorable payments, can't inflate it, can't take it from you, and there you go. That's what it does. And it's like that kind of simplicity, pierces the veil. And I think we will, if we can apply that same sort of level of principle to other real world problems in the meat space, in the atom space, I think we'll find solutions to things that these days are just over complexified by bureaucratic morons and people who try and place themselves in positions of power so that they can validate their basically worthless fucking existence by saying, oh, we have to do all of this crap to fix this phantom problem, which is not really a problem, but it's kind of a problem, but we can't really define the problem, so we just use a bunch of statistics and numbers to make it look like a problem, and no one ever reads the shit, so we all think it's a fucking problem. So anyway, I just think that ties into conciliation for me.
I like that a lot. I've got to jump off here in 2 minutes for a call, so I just to tie out a couple of things here. The dematerialization point, I think this is a bigger deal than most of us realize. In the age of the internet, where it was just bits and bytes, which were representations of atoms, right, of real stuff, that actually opened up the gate for a lot more bullshit in a lot of ways. It increased our productivity in many respects, but I think we needed something like Bitcoin to anchor the bits and the bytes into the atomic universe. So I think the grander scope here is we're going to see dematerialization result in the demonopolization of most markets, because the use of force is neutralized effectively in digital space, right? With things like Bitcoin, or if we can figure out a way to do cryptographically provable property rights, that's another aspect of it. So I think the end game here is that legislation loses a lot of effect, because again, it can't confiscate, it can't redistribute wealth. Therefore, humans are just going to become more self-organized instead of being corralled by states. We're going to move into something that looks much more like a complex, adaptive system versus something that's command and control as we currently are today. To that point, it's like ultimately it's all about the property rights at the end of the day. That's the reason the state exists. That's the reason economies exist. It's to facilitate trade flows of property. And that's what Bitcoin is, right? It's a timeless claim. You can think of a property right as a claim on space-time, right? It's a claim on either physical space and territory, or a claim on the time of someone to provide a service or produce a good. Bitcoin's a timeless claim on space and time. So it's this natural law, which is the right to life, liberty, and property enshrined in unbreakable cryptography. So I think that's why it's such a big deal. And with that, I got to bounce. This has been awesome, guys.
Thanks, Rob. Appreciate it, man. Adios, amigo. Thank you,
Thanks, see ya.
Thanks for having me, brother.
I, too, am going to have to rematerialize myself here in a minute. I just wanted to finish up saying thanks, guys, for this conversation. It is 4 years now down the rabbit hole, and it's fun to still have these conversations and seek these kinds of truths about Bitcoin out and talk about how Bitcoin will change the future. It's amazing to watch this all play out like we've all thought it would over the last 4 or 5 years. I think, to me, what I'm really excited about is Bitcoin giving us back time in a broad way, especially people whose time has been stolen to such a great degree that it's hard for them to kind of satisfy basic needs of their lives. And so we'll empower enable a lot of people around the world who have been disadvantaged because, we've been living in a country here that has had the world reserve currency for a few generations, and the countries who have been aligned with us economically speaking and militarily speaking have benefited from that as well, and financially and economically speaking have benefited from that as well. So I'm really excited about the rest of the world that has been really disadvantaged because of this system of time theft, to elevate their lives and existences up that Maslow's hierarchy, to be able to eventually control their own time, reach their full potential, their creative potential, and just be happy and be fulfilled. So that's what I'm looking forward to, and hoping that Bitcoin can bring about in the coming decades for us all. Thanks for the great conversation, guys.
Amen.
Thank you, Brady.
Appreciate it, Brady. Have a good night. While we're in a sort of a transitionary period, I would love to bring up a point, sort of a conversation I had with an evolutionary biologist recently. It's a woman, Toby Kears, who studies the economics of mycology or fungi. And I guess my takeaway from this podcast we recorded was that free market economic behavior is actually a fundamental evolutionary force, like from way back billion years ago or longer. And that's part of the process that led to evolution, all the way up to Homo sapiens. And so to frame this up, there's this idea called the Gaia hypothesis, which came out in the 70s, which is kind of like communist ecology, or essentially the whole planet is a single living species or a single organism that works together in sort of this kumbaya way. And then recent science sort of contradicts that previous communist ecology, and it's showing more of a market-based competitive ecology. And so that's based on trade. And yeah, of course, organisms, mostly fungi and plants, they work together, but it's not necessarily through the goodness of their heart. They trade, and it's primarily these economic interactions. And Toby and other scientists have actually demonstrated this in a lab, and they're showing things like fungi implement trade policy. And they figure out who are good trade partners and give them better deals, and who's stingy with their trade. You sort of de-emphasize them, and they build their trade networks to facilitate a higher economic output for themselves. And this is sort of based on finite resources in all over the world, and also in ecology, right? There's only a limited amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon, etc. And interestingly, Toby brought this up where she was saying that fungi reveal trading strategies that are completely uncontaminated with cognition. Right? They don't have central nervous systems or brains or emotions in the same way that we do. And so they're just rational economic decisions, no emotions like hope or resentment or whatever. It's sort of like economic behavior in its most pure and ancestral form. And this tension, this competition between species is actually really important. They want to find resources, they want to reproduce, and that enables specialization, that enables greater wealth through trade. And all organisms compete, and then there's a greater outcome at the end, 1 + 1 = 3. And so, yeah, again, I guess back to my original point here, which is that free market economic behavior is fundamental to biology. It is an evolutionary force that literally produced humans as a branch on the taxonomic tree.
I love that. I've always, I think what you mentioned there is like, people, I think, lose sight of what economics is, because, we get taught in university and, everywhere that economics is basically some sort of study of how much money the government prints and where hedge funds are going to allocate it, and that just couldn't be further from the truth. Like I always say, economics is the fundamental study of existence. Like before you can study, psychology or any of other things, you start with economics, and economics is literally, the study of the action. And, for the anthroposphere, like in relation to human beings, it's the study of human action. But, as you just sort of described then, it goes far beyond just how humans behave, but it's how every single organism behaves. It's, when you think just biologically and evolutionarily, you start to realize that, there is no organism, there is no species, there is nothing that exists that can escape that table of truth that I discussed earlier, this idea of completely finite resources, finite energy, finite time, and a direction to time, so an uncertain future. So as a result, all species, all organisms, everything that exists has to somehow prioritize interaction with its environment and with other species around it. And prioritization is economics. You deciding who gets what and how is economics at its fundamental essence. And that's like sort of when we think of it in the economics that's a bit closer to what people understand when they think about economics is sort of prices and supply, demand, and buying shit and markets and stuff like that. Price is that information that permeates through the anthropological ecosystem, the how we're all interconnected, and price tells us how much or how important something is. It enables that prioritization. It enables us to interact, cooperate, and to exist. And I just love that analogy. Is it's not just humans, but it involves every layer in the stack. So I encourage everyone to sort of think about economics much more holistically than how it's been framed to you at university and crap like that.
And also, if you want proof that this is deeply embedded in psychology, I encourage listeners to look up a short YouTube video of monkeys doing small jobs for grapes. And one monkey doesn't get the deserved payment, and it really bothers him. So I think you can find it quite quickly if you just Google for monkey trading grapes, something like that. And it's very obvious that this is innate in multiple species, not just humans. And I think it's also worth pointing out that, again, as we discussed previously, money is kind of an emergent phenomenon. And it has to emerge because just of the sheer complexity and the sheer scale of the interactions. So once you are in a tribe that reaches a certain size, most people are probably aware of Dunbar's number, which is around 150. This is approximately the number of connections you can keep in your head. So everyone who has more than 150 friends, close friends, is basically lying to you because the human brain can't do it. And this is also just a signaling and keeping track of favors mechanism. One nature of money is that, at least. So yes, it's deeply biological, and once you understand it, it shouldn't be surprising that it pops up all over the place.
I just tweeted out that video, if anyone wants to see what Gigi was referencing. And Gigi, you can check my Twitter and make sure that's the right video.
Any video will do, I guess. Any video that has a raging monkey in it.
Brandon, man, that was the video of my brother. How dare you?
I like that point about, looking to nature. And Brandon, you've done that so well in your writing and, the analogies that you've made. And we always in this space harp on the fact that we've been cut off from free markets and money and all the downstream effects that has on freedom of markets as a result of, let's say, fiat money and the central banking architecture and all that kind of stuff, which on this scale, I agree with. But, it makes me think there's really nothing but free markets, right? There's really nothing but action and reaction. We may not think what we're subjected to as a result of that is fair, based on our own, principles and values and perspective. But it's almost like whether in nature or in the realm of human action, I mean, all there is free markets, and all there is a tree falling on a little sapling, and it either dies or it pushes its way through the soil, comes up around the tree, ends up, wrapping around another tree. And you know what I mean? So it's like, I think what we're doing collectively is just simply saying, it's just responding to an action that has happened in the market in which we operate, in the time in which we operate. And so, I guess I'm speaking across scales here, because no one's going to argue that the central banking, the fiat money has imposed an unfree market. But if we're looking at it maybe at a higher level, I think there's nothing but free markets, and maybe we're too, as a collective humanity, maybe we definitely have probably become too used to, or too desiring of putting an architecture on top of that to try to act as though that weren't the case, or to try to make it more fair, when it's not even possible. It's just action and reaction. And maybe if we have that framework, people would be happier, but they'd also take more responsibility to act as though that were true, and it wasn't just something that they had to wait to change or fix or improve. I don't know if that came across clearly, but
yeah, let me try to reiterate. So essentially, if we zoom out, the state is also acting in accordance to a free market if we just assume everything is a free market. And so that makes sense, right? We respond to that action, which is also a free market action. And if we want to, again, tie it to this analogy, we could say then that the state just essentially has too much power. And by having too much power, or having some sort of a monopoly, it just makes the game less productive. And so it sort of just siphons resources. And in a Bitcoin world, we would hope that there's a weaker state which would allow greater economic prosperity. Is that what you mean, John?
I think that's procedurally how it goes. I guess I'm just saying, regardless of how we value the state of affairs as they are, I mean, it's always the case, right? If you bring it back to, let's say a forest analogy, some plants may end up getting the most sunlight or the most nutrients, whatever, and they grow at the expense of others in the system. But, ultimately there's something governing the balance or the success or the life of the system. And, this is just really just popped into my mind, so it's not a very well-formed thought. But as much as I decry, just like everybody else, the unfairness that's instituted by these institutions, and I certainly stand by that, again, on a higher level, I kind of have to accept that, there's nothing but free markets. There's nothing but action and reaction. And, the only real thing you can do is try to act in accord with your values and perhaps in your best interests. And I guess this, to some degree, ties back to the idea of a meta incentive and aligning incentives to try to maneuver that landscape most effectively.
I feel like this is it's a bit confounded, because this idea of a free market when you have fiat money, I'm of the opinion that fiat money in the equation obfuscates things to such an extreme degree that while on the face there's free market exchange, with these obfuscations that have occurred with the amount of fiat money that's pumped into the system, with the way people game the entire taxation system, and that there's this entire focus on financial assets, that everything's distorted in this very extreme way, versus then when you actually have something like Bitcoin, which actually has all of these free access mechanisms, and we can arguably say is the freest currency in the world because of the way that access is allowed. I think it changes stuff in a pretty radical way that fundamentally shifts our perspective. And I think as Bitcoiners, you and I understand that free market perspective, but I think people perhaps trapped in the system, not fully understanding Bitcoin, might not necessarily see it that way. But
100%. I agree with that. I guess if I can summarize it maybe a bit more clearly, is that on a meta level, higher level, the people behind, let's say, the fiat currency system, you could make the case that they're just competing better in the market that is reality, more effectively than everyone who they're subjugating to their system. And so, I agree, Eric, that, maybe on the more relevant domain of our everyday lives, I wouldn't just throw up my hands and say, to not bring these issues to light and not to educate about them and not to push back on them. But, I just, if we're looking at different perspectives and across scales, I can, if you frame things up as everything being a free market, then I think it just inspires better competition from all parties. Satoshi wasn't there. And look, we all know this. Like, this is what gold bugs did for years, and this is what libertarians do. They say, please, like, can we have a more free market? You know, and they're appealing to their masters, whether they be the money masters or the government or whatever. Come on, guys, like, wouldn't it be better if we could all just operate in a free or fairer market? And that's not how it goes, right? So Satoshi came along, not, you know, wishing for a solution, but deciding that, you know, the market was yearning for something better, or a suspicion that was the case, built it, and it's become what it has become, and I'm sure we all suspect it to become more in the future. So look, I kind of just playing devil's advocate or speaking across scales, because I'm no, you know, I fully appreciate the downsides of the existing market structure, but just kind of saying that you could frame it and say, you know, they're just competing better, and we've all accepted that. And the sooner we decide not to accept that and actually build solutions or do what we can to compete better against them, that's the only approach there ever is, I guess, is what I'm saying.
I like that point, John, and I think I love that. Now. Essentially, we're playing a nation-state game right now, again, using sovereign individual. It's the nation-state with the biggest weapons that are in charge, the most power you can amass, you make the rules. That's where we are. And it's always that game. And Satoshi essentially said, hey, it's not working for the people here. I'm going to try to build a new game instead of fix it. So essentially saying, well, let's try to outcompete the nation-state. And a tool like Bitcoin, which is built on encryption and maybe a few other different things, that actually shifts the logic of violence, and it gives the little guy a chance. And so I guess Bitcoin is sort of like a Hail Mary to take power away from the state. And that's all there ever is a competition.
I think it even goes, I love that. I think it even goes, I'm going to try to dig one layer deeper, which is this idea that, we've always been striving to emerge from something. So if you just look at the story of humanity, it's like, we emerged from the sludge, basically. It was barely 150 years ago that we were wiping our ass with our left hand and eating with the right hand, right? So it's like, we've sort of, it's been this consistent striving, and it's silly to think that we wouldn't have had all of, we wouldn't have had the state in the, format that it is today, that we wouldn't have had religion and all this sort of stuff, because, that somehow Bitcoin could have fixed it back in the day or something like that. It's silly to think that, because these sort of things build on themselves. And the example I use, I did a podcast with Jimmy Song and the guys called Bitcoin Preachers ages ago. And what I sort of talked about in there is that, life is this process of experimentation, and when we open this conversation, we actually spoke about principles. So, as life experiments, there's going to be it tries 10 things, and of the 10 things that it tries, 8 are fucking ludicrous and 2 seem to work. So then those sort of 2 move on, and there's an example of what works there. And then of those 2 things, another 20 things spawn, and of those 20, maybe 15 are fucking shit and 5 sort of work, and then they sort of spawn other things. And that process of life continues. And over time, these grooves appear that are principles that are sort of timeless, that work, that function. And the existence of the state, the existence of, a monopoly on money is not sort of just something that happened since 1971. It's money has always been a reality, and, it makes perfect sense for somebody to try and get a monopoly on the money if the capacity to have a monopoly on money exists. It is game theoretically sound. Like that is so if we look at it as a zoom out to a larger chunk of a free market, we can see that different tribes, different empires, different countries, different whatever, the church, different incarnations of these institutions of I guess living, all of them were in some sort of economic battle for dominance. And along the way, we sort of got better, and at times we got worse at this competitive game. And I would argue that we've sort of, the last 100 years has been unique because, so I don't buy into the Steven Pinker idea of, fucking everything's just getting better and, everything's always, better. I kind of look at it more nuanced than that, which is we have had so much economic and technological progress over the last 100 years that it has actually masked the growing parasite that is the state along the way. So we think that that we're so much better, but we have also eroded a bunch of other things along the way, but we haven't noticed it too much because we've created so much extra wealth and, technology has been so, such a driving force that we've been able to allow this parasite to grow almost unnoticed along the way. But we've sort of come to a point now where the parasite is so large that the economic game being played is so divergent from reality. Like this is one of those examples of life, trying 10 things. And, this is one of the 8 deranged things that falls apart. And the 2 that sort of emerge successful are going to be, that are going to continue. So we're sort of in the ugly experiment version of this continuation. So trying to tie these thoughts together, it's like, we're in the bad part of the experiment phase, and Bitcoin. I love what John said earlier, is that it is almost a reaction, and we said this earlier. It's like the sort of reaction that has emerged that is a better competitor, like it's the apex predator of money, which my friend Rory, who's a Bitcoin pleb, shout out to Rory, says he calls it the apex predator of money. But it's it's sort of the apex predator of human organization, and it will fucking eat alive the fake game basically that's been played. That, again, was inevitable to be played, because if it was you or I or whatever sort of growing up in, the emergence of the nation state at the time, we would have probably made similar decisions to, what the US did along the way and all this sort of stuff. And the thing is, these decisions just have these weird knock-on effects. So if we sort of zoom out and look at it on a grander time scale, Bitcoin's going to sort of eat all of that alive just through the sheer force of economic Darwinism. Like, these things can't compete against Bitcoin. It's going to obliterate them because it's far more rooted in reality, because it's aligned with nature, because it sort of is built off of these principles that are time tested. Like all the stuff that we're doing now, whilst it does still align more broadly with the competitive nature of existence, it is a losing side of the competitive nature of existence. And it was just part of the process of sort of getting to Bitcoin. So I don't know how well I've articulated that, but I just sort of, I love that framing. It is a free market still, and Bitcoin is going to dominate that because it is a freer market and is more rooted in, organic, natural, emergent principles.
I'd love to bring up a sort of a practical thing here, which is that if the idea of sovereignism or, the sovereign individual, or we're going to fracture into smaller states and sort of reduce the size of our mega states, the existing power structures are going to fight back to that. And so it's in our best interest to sort of be strategic in how we accomplish those goals. And so I was thinking about this idea where we're essentially identifying as Bitcoiners rather than our nation state. Right. So if we start with that, now we have this digital community. We congregate on Twitter and Clubhouse and hopefully other more decentralized forms of communication. And we start to codify social norms and values. And, if Bitcoin continues to go up in price, we have more Bitcoiners in political office. All of a sudden, this sort of decentralized state living in cyberspace gains power and capital. And then at a certain point, this community that lives online becomes powerful enough to actually transition towards meat space. Think like we have enough capital and influence to buy Texas, or a failed state wants to sell us half their jurisdiction, and we essentially bail them out while simultaneously gaining a landmass. And so I guess I'm just curious about this from a strategy perspective and what you guys have to say.
I've thought a lot about this actually, and like I think Alex, I think you and me spoke about this on your podcast too, that like there needs to be multiple citadels, and that they need to, that we're going to need to be spread out kind of all around the globe, and that like a single jurisdiction won't work because we need the decentralization and we also need the redundancy. And so like, I think like having at least one established in both hemispheres in conjunction with having coastal access to be able to have sea lanes. And I actually think that this is tied towards moving back towards seeing what other kind of alternative territories that there are outside of the nation state, such as something like Antarctica or space, and how this all actually leads and frankly like compels this totally new topology of war, and frankly like a new strategy of how a civil war over wealth is carried out through these new strategic norms. That I don't think it's of any coincidence that cryptography is the thing that powers the whole thing underneath the hood in order to make it work. And so I actually think like this is a fundamental evolution of humans beyond the stage of the nation state to, what seems to be more and more like some nebulous, decentralized, much smaller base states, which I actually think is pretty closely linked to the idea of what anarcho-syndicalism originally kind of presented itself as, and perhaps even at its more radical stages where kind of everybody's on board, something that looks like anarcho-communism.
Word. All right, guys, we've been on for 2 hours. I don't know what your schedules are, but we do have quite a bit of intellectual firepower in the audience. I'm curious if you guys would like to invite open hand raising, and I can invite a few people up to ask questions.
Brandon, to make your life easier, I'd suggest making all of us mods, and then if you're bringing some people up like Brokey, Justine, and stuff, it'll make life easier for you.
I'll take this opportunity to say thanks and good night. It's kind of late and I'll have to go to sleep soon. So, I'll have to say goodbye for the time. But it was a really nice chat. Always awesome to talk Bitcoin with you guys. And thanks for the discussion. And thanks everyone for listening.
Same to you, Gigi. Number one fan. I love your work. Thank you.
Always a pleasure. Hey, everyone, make sure you follow Gigi. Click on his profile, give him a follow. He's new to Clubhouse. We convinced him to get an iPhone for this, so give him some love. All right, I'm going to turn hand raising on. I knew Radu would be the first one to raise his hand. Welcome, Radu. What you got, buddy?
Hey, I enjoyed listening to all that. It's very interesting. I do have an idea that I want to share, though, and I want to see how people respond to this. People talked about how Bitcoin represents a convergence phenomenon, but I think it goes deeper than that, because I think all of history is converging towards this singular point. Because if you think of ideas as information, if you think of all ideas that we generate really are recursively linked to ideas that were generated in the past. And if you think of information in this fashion, then you end up seeing time and development as being this fractal kind of pattern that exists. So I just see this whole thing as being like inevitable and predestined, and it's all of history converging towards a singular point. And I feel like this ties into mythology. It ties into it's fascinating how in different philosophical branches, like in Eastern philosophy and Western philosophy, you have this notion of eschatology, and like these eschatologies emerge independently from each other. And yet they all point to the same thing. They point to this notion of the end of time. And I feel like that ties into this notion that information is fractal-like in nature, and it converges towards a singular point. I'm just going to leave it at that for now. Does that make sense?
Fuck yeah, I think that's awesome. And I agree with you. Like there is this very interesting eschatological thread that's going on. And like Bitcoin, like it's not a blockchain, it's a time chain. And like, what the fuck does that mean? And that's like really interesting that it's this piece of technology that we've so seemingly been given, in this extraordinary and graceful way by this man who, for all intents and purposes, is the most powerful and wealthy human being on the planet, not by virtue of him doing something, but by him not doing something, which through the standstill of what he's doing is pretty extraordinary. So this is the stuff I really like to think about, and kind of really pushes the boundaries of my thoughts, because I think they're really important questions and ideas that a lot of people don't take into consideration because they're so focused on the economic aspect, which is, again, it's also hilarious that like through the economic promises of Bitcoin, it causes them to stumble down this rabbit hole that now has them dealing with these deeply ontological questions that fundamentally changes their being in a lot of ways.
To me, one quick thing, Radu, it sounds like you've been reading some Terence McKenna, or if not, just a happy accident. But towards the end of his life, he kept talking about the eschaton or the concrescence, or, that end point in time. And I'm curious if that's part of your influence or if that was separate and unrelated.
It is part of my influence, but it's also tied to the pre-Columbian Mesoamerican calendars, because they talked about a grand awakening happening at some point in the future. And it's interesting how their prediction mapped to Terence McKenna's prediction, even though he didn't work off of that. So they both converged toward this point in time, which was 2012, which is interesting because I think in December 2012 is when one of the first bull runs started, like proper bull runs in Bitcoin. So it's just interesting how all of these things converge. And I know it sounds crazy and like we're just on the border of lunacy, but I feel like it cannot be ignored.
No, I totally agree. And, like on my blog, Crypto Sovereignty, like one of my latest pieces was Messianic Bitcoin. Like, it's really crazy, but I actually believe that this can have a messianic effect on the outcome of human history, because it's fundamentally challenging state power in an extreme and radical way. And also we need to look at the concourse of the development of human history after World War II, both with what was discovered cryptographically, but also the production of nuclear armaments. It caused for the development of human history to really go off in this crazy and extreme place where now we have these weapons that could fundamentally destroy all human existence. And now we have this ability through this sly roundabout way of money to actually strip out the ability for the state not only to extort wealth from people, but from even using this vehicle of fiat money, because they once had the ability as a centralized authority to be able to coordinate money at a much more greater efficiency, that we've now literally hijacked and created a monetary network that's thousands of times better, along with an asset that's thousands of times better. I actually think like this is kind of game over for the state, which I believe actually is an astrological question, because it's coming to challenge the idea and the notion of what law is in its entirety. And it's giving us something radically different, which we're slowly coming to the understanding of what it is. And keep in mind, like, the internet's this brand new thing that if you went back 100 years ago and told people, hey, there's this way to communicate with somebody on the other side of the planet and coordinate with them, you're just out of your fucking mind. There's no reason to even discuss that. So I think these are all very important developments that really have us dealing with, something that's much more extreme than just a change in money, but it's a change in human organization and the potentiality of a totally different future that's radically free of violence from this extremely novel idea.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah, and I don't know.
So you're not crazy.
And what's interesting?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Radu.
What's interesting is that like messianic events happen in the past, like I think a lot of scientists kind of discredit them because they just sound like fantasy, I guess. But I feel like now through the prism of Bitcoin, I can envision how that might be. Like I like the thing that I came up with was that like humanity is sort of this like supercomputer that's trying to like solve a problem, and it goes through cycles, and which with every cycle it kind of lays down a foundation, like a foundational layer. And I think right now the foundational layer is going to be money. I think maybe in the past there were other foundational layers that we like put down that we're not even aware of now.
Well, and in this case, I would actually beg to differ that it's not money, but it's cryptography. And the way that we've all pneumatically started to understand cryptography and what it means is extremely important, because like you with your 24 seed private key, like that's this sacred series of words that only you will ever know. It can only ever be produced that one time it was produced for you. And if you lose it, like game over, it's gone. It can never, ever come back. And so through these assurances that cryptography offers us, and through a new way of understanding knowledge and utilizing the internet as this praxis to enhance our capacity and ability to be able to utilize these tools, I think through cryptography, we're now discovering this new form of human organization. And of that, money is the very first agreement utilizing this new praxis.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I was going to add one more point here to the fact that all these different ways to measure cycles in time are converging. From an astrology perspective, which I'm not very steeped in myself, but my hippie friends like to remind me of this. We just entered the age of Aquarius, which is roughly a 2,000-year cycle, and we transitioned in 2020. And that is, in Greek mythology, Aquarius is Prometheus, and that's the god who stole fire from the gods and gave it to the humans. And there's all these very strange symbolic parallels to what we're potentially going to be experiencing with Bitcoin. Again, one of those is a transition into a new renaissance.
Yeah, it's crazy. I used to completely dismiss astrology, but now I feel like there's something to it.
I mean, like, I think all these forms of knowledge have something to it. And, you know, I don't need to discredit them anyway, but, you know, the more I explore other esoteric topics, the kind of the more I'm along for the ride and interested.
Totally. Clayton, welcome to the stage. Do you have a question or comment you'd like to add?
Hey, what's going on, guys? I heard you guys talking about astrology and Bitcoin, and that's something that I'm that's deep in my heart. So I just wanted to join in on the conversation, man. I think it's awesome what you guys are talking about.
Cool, man. Welcome.
Yeah. So I've been studying the cycles of like I've heard on here a few times before about this, like, you know, these time cycles, and I've been studying these 84-year cycles of Uranus and moving through the tropical sign of Taurus. Uranus is currently in Taurus from our perspective on Earth here. And if we look back 84 years from this current time and before that, it kind of fits real neatly into, you know, these fourth turnings I keep hearing about. So I thought it was pretty cool that, you know, the fourth turnings were actually talking about these cycles of Uranus and Taurus. And, you know, we've seen, FDR's New Deal. We've seen gold being discovered, and, you know, with the California Gold Rush and the Pikes Peak Gold Rush, a whole bunch of underground railroad activity, you know, and oil being discovered in Saudi, in the Middle East, I should say. So I just found it like amazing how you have this correspondence of this global kind of change in value, or change in, you know, the way we exchange value during these time periods. And I believe somebody was talking about like the Mesoamerican calendars lining up. I'm also very into a system called the Destiny cards, and it lines up very neatly with astrology. And it's interesting how these different systems all converge on this time and now. And in the year 2008, Pluto entered into the sign of tropical Capricorn, and that pointed to just a reorganization, the transformation of the foundation of the governmental structures of the world. So, you know, that's when we started to see a lot of things start to change, and this grand awakening started to happen, like that first wave. And it's going to be in Capricorn until 2024, which is when we're expecting to see like some other major shifts in consciousness when Pluto enters Aquarius. So,
hey guys, I got to bounce. So I just wanted to say thanks for the time, and this was a lot of fun. I'll see you all around. All right.
Cheers, Eric. Thanks for hanging.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, guys, I got to bounce too. I really appreciate the conversation. Love you guys, and I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
Thanks, Sean. Great to have you. Let's definitely do something like this again.
Yeah, so I heard you guys talking, man. I just want to jump up here and add a little bit of my insight from my studies and whatnot. So thanks for inviting me on stage.
Yeah, appreciate it, Clayton. It's an awesome perspective. And I really should jump back into it at Swan here, although it looks like the Swan team just hangs out in Clubhouse all day. Sometimes we also do work. I don't know if Alex or Radu, you guys want to lead, or if we should just shut her down tonight. What do you guys think?
Svetski is trying to pick between a number of Tinder dates, so I think I'm going to finish up.
All right, cool. I say we just wrap it up then. I can just give us a little closing words here. This conversation was run under the Cafe Bitcoin Club. And so if you look on the stage up here, you'll see a little green house. That's Cafe Bitcoin. If you click that and follow the club, you'll be notified when we have future conversations. And depending on how this went, I would love to hear some feedback from you guys. So if you send me a DM on Twitter, just give me any feedback. Should we do this next week? Did you like it? What would you change? I personally love these conversations, so I could do them daily, but I think something weekly would be fun. And also, any of the mods who inspired you today, give them a follow, and you'll be notified when future rooms open up.
Sweet. Thanks, Brandon. I think we should do this once a month or something, man. I think that was awesome. Catch up.
Love it. Sounds great, Alex. Good luck on your Tinder dates.
Thanks, Bill. I was actually kidding. I actually got some work to do. But anyway, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate everyone listening in. And yeah, I will see you guys on the next Cosmic Conversation or whatever. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Awesome. I'm shutting it down. Thanks, Radu. Thanks, Clayton. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, everyone, for listening.
Peace.
Cheers.